She arrived not with fanfare, but in silence. A worn blue parka clung to her narrow shoulders, threadbare and sun-bleached. The bitter wind tugged at the frayed cuffs, swirling dust around her boots. Boots whose soles had thinned and split from the weight of too many miles. The base gate loomed ahead under floodlights that bathed the gravel in ghostly white, casting long shadows behind her. A line of fresh recruits stood waiting in crisp uniforms and polished boots, their chatter loud and eager. Among them, her presence was a rupture in rhythm, a bruise in the uniformity. She was out of place. She was not like them. The sergeant at the checkpoint raised an eyebrow, then sneered. "You lost, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice too loud, performative. "This isn't the food line. You're at a combat base." She didn't speak, didn't even flinch. He reached forward, grabbing the dull gray strap of the backpack she carried. It was battered, stained, sagging. Not military issue. Not anything that belonged in a place built on protocol and precision. "What have we got here?" he muttered as he yanked it off her shoulder. The motion jolted her slightly, but she didn't resist. The recruits began to murmur, leaning in to catch a better look. Something about the way she stood, calm, still, like a soldier at ease, made them uneasy. But the sergeant saw only what he expected to see. He began pulling items out of the bag, tossing them onto the check-in table. A threadbare pair of gloves, a faded photo folded twice over, an old pocket knife dulled from use, a waterlogged notebook, its cover peeling like skin. Mocking laughter bubbled behind him. "Logistics?" a female recruit said with a curled lip. "They let civilians wander around now?" "Maybe she got lost on the way to clean the latrines," someone else called out. Sarah said nothing. Her dark hair was unkempt, windswept across a pale face drawn thin by time and tension. Her eyes, however, gray, unreadable, remained locked ahead, not blinking. "Where's your ID?" the sergeant snapped. "Your paperwork? Your orders?" In response, Sarah slowly reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a single crumpled sheet. The sergeant took it, squinting at the ink that had faded with moisture and time. "Logistics volunteer," he read, shaking his head. "That's not even a proper clearance." Then she spoke, quiet, calm. "I have a summons." The words hung in the air like a sharp note in a silent hall. One of the corporals leaned over, his eyes scanning the paper. He chuckled. "A summons? For what? You're here to mop floors." "She's bluffing," the young female recruit said. "Probably trying to fake her way onto the base." A captain approached from the back, older, hardened. His face was carved with lines of consequence. He looked from Sarah to the sergeant. "If she's got a summons, let her state who issued it." Sarah met the captain's gaze and uttered a phrase that turned the world on its side. 5 words, no more. To the untrained ear, it was nonsense, a string of guttural syllables that had no place in a standard security phrase. But the captain froze. His pupils narrowed and his breath caught in his throat. That phrase hadn't been uttered in nearly a decade. It belonged to a defunct protocol, black tier clearance, access reserved for operatives who were ghosts even among shadows. The radio stopped crackling. Even the wind seemed to hush. The recruits fell silent, sensing something shift beneath their feet. Kyle, the sergeant, laughed nervously. "Okay, sure. Let's see what else she's hiding." He turned back to the backpack, annoyed now, digging deeper. His hand struck something solid, unfamiliar. He pulled it out. A box. It was palm-sized, weighty, with no markings. The surface was a muted steel black, but with faint blue undertones that shifted when the light caught it. It pulsed, not literally, but there was something inside it that seemed alive. The box was completely sealed, smooth to the touch, seamless. "What the hell is this?" Kyle muttered, trying to force it open. He couldn't. He handed it to a tech sergeant nearby. "Here, you're the gadget guy." The sergeant held it to his ear, shook it like it was a toy. Probably empty, or a prank. He tossed it back onto the table. Sarah stepped forward, calmly, unblinking. "Give it back," she said. Her voice was quiet, but unshakable. Kyle hesitated, then placed it in her open palm. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She simply set the box down, pressed 3 precise points on its surface, and waited. Click. The lid popped open. The room gasped. Inside was a metal the color of the ocean at midnight. Edged in silver, 2 serpents intertwined at the center, and engraved beneath them, Delta Zero. The color drained from Kyle's face. A major stepped into the room, saw the metal, and went stiff. His lips parted, but no words emerged. Then, slowly, he removed his cap and stood at attention. More boots echoed down the corridor. An older colonel, heavyset, approached. He took one look at the open box and went ghost white. No questions, no orders. He saluted, high and sharp. "Impossible," he murmured. "It doesn't exist." Sarah closed the lid with a soft snap. She returned the box to her backpack and sat back down, waiting. She didn't need to speak. The room had already spoken for her. The energy in the room had shifted. What once pulsed with mockery and dismissive laughter was now as still as an empty battlefield after the last shot has been fired. No one dared to meet Sarah's eyes. A lieutenant, a narrow-faced man with tightly clenched fists and a voice always a little too loud, stepped forward in an effort to reclaim control of the narrative unraveling before him. "So what?" he snapped, voice brittle and echoing. "Some fancy box and a good poker face. She's still got no rank, no papers. This could have been stolen for all we know." He didn't believe the words as he spoke them. Not really, but authority has a way of demanding certainty, even in the face of doubt. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have to. The box now rested beside her like a sleeping beast. Its presence, quiet but immovable, said more than words could. The serpents carved into its lid stared up at the fluorescent lights, daring anyone to touch it again. Kyle stepped backward, his confidence hemorrhaging through the cracks in his posture. His hands trembled slightly as he busied himself with cleaning up the contents he had earlier scattered. One of the officers, the female who had mocked Sarah's photo, suddenly looked more curious than cruel. She picked up the creased picture again, studied it in the sterile light. The woman in it looked like Sarah, softer, smiling, her eyes warm but distant. The kind of photo people fold up and keep next to their heart, not their belongings. "Your mother?" the officer asked, softer now, as if something in her had shifted. "She was," Sarah replied. 2 words, as final as a closing door. They landed with a thud that none of the recruits expected. The officer blinked, then without a word returned the photograph, this time carefully. A tech officer at the back of the room quietly opened a secure military laptop and typed Sarah's name into the database. A second passed, then another. The screen blinked red. Access restricted. Clearance level. Intercontinental Security Council. Tier 0. The room exhaled collectively, almost unwillingly. It was no longer a question of credentials. This was confirmation of a ghost. A janitor, gray-haired, limping slightly, had paused his sweeping. Until now, no one noticed him. But as the red warning flashed on the text screen, he stepped slowly into the room, leaning on his broom like a cane. "I knew a girl once," he said, his voice rough and scarred. "She saved my unit in '03. Took out an enemy nest with 1 bullet through 3 men. Vanished before dawn." He didn't say Sarah's name. He didn't have to. The room absorbed the silence that followed. The recruits, the same ones who had mocked her moments ago, now couldn't meet her gaze. "I didn't come for recognition," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "I came because I was summoned, and I still believe in the mission." It wasn't said for sympathy. It wasn't a declaration. It was truth. The kind you don't yell, but one the air wraps itself around. Still, bureaucracy must try to reassert itself. A younger officer spoke up, clinging to what protocol remained. No matter her background, she still has to qualify. No badge, no standing orders, no exemption. Sarah nodded. "Then let's begin." They led her to the firing range, a stretch of wind-beaten gravel, metal targets arranged like ghosts in formation, the wind whispering stories of those who had missed their mark. The recruits followed behind, trailing her like a procession of doubts now uncertain of their purpose. A pistol was placed in her hands. No sight adjustments, no ear protection, just the standard issue sidearm. 50 yards out, 3 targets. A sergeant gave a lazy nod. Fire when ready. Sarah raised the pistol. Her posture was calm, like a violinist taking position before the opening note. No flourish, no drama, just precision. Crack. One bullet. 3 targets dropped. Dead center. Perfect alignment. The crowd behind her didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply watched. And in that silence, everything shifted. An older man at the back, with sun-wrinkled skin and a voice that hadn't cracked in decades, finally spoke. "I've seen that shot," he said almost reverently. "Years ago. 1 shooter, 1 bullet, 3 kills." He didn't say her name either. He didn't need to. A colonel stepped forward, folder in hand. Wordless, he handed it to her. Inside, the classified list of a new task force. Sarah was listed not as a recruit, but as the leader. Kyle watched from the edge of the range, stripped of his stripes. No longer sergeant. He said nothing. Not a whisper, not an apology. But his eyes, which had once laughed, now refused to rise above her boots. And Sarah? She didn't linger. She didn't gloat. She placed the folder under one arm and walked away. She left behind a range transformed, not by explosion, not by volume, but by stillness, by the kind of precision that doesn't need approval to be undeniable. The ripple didn't stop at the edge of the firing range. It spread through the hallways, through the chain of command, through whispered conversations that started as gossip and ended as reverence. Everyone, officers, clerks, janitors, and rookies, now carried her name in their mouths like a secret they weren't sure they deserved to speak. Sarah's walk from the range back to the operations wing was not announced. No brass band, no fanfare. Just the sound of her boots against tile floors and gravel paths, and the hush that followed in her wake. The same officers who had once narrowed their eyes at her now stood straighter as she passed. Not out of obligation, but out of something heavier. Regret, reverence, and fear. Not the kind that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from having misjudged someone so completely. Kyle was summoned to the colonel's office that afternoon. He walked in with a spine still stiff with pride. He came out without stripes on his shoulder. He didn't speak. His face was pale, lips pressed into a straight, hard line. His boots no longer stomped with dominance. They dragged. The female recruit, the one with the biting sarcasm and perfect eyeliner, disappeared from the roster by nightfall. Rumor had it a video had surfaced, her shoving Sarah aside at check-in, her name tagged and trending. The base denied it, but her bunk was empty the next morning and her nameplate gone. The lieutenant who called Sarah's medal a trinket? He was spotted pacing outside the colonel's office, whispering frantically into his phone. His skin was ashen, his voice choked with panic. "I didn't know. No one told me. She looked like..." No one cared what she looked like anymore. By evening, a reassignment order appeared in his inbox. Remote, cold, unforgiving. The kind of post they send people to when their presence is more liability than asset. He didn't protest, because Sarah didn't need to retaliate. The truth had already done the work for her. The next morning, Sarah sat alone at a long metal table, the classified task force dossier open in front of her. Her fingers moved carefully across each page, flipping one after another with clinical precision. She had read mission profiles like this before. She had written them. But there was something different this time, an ache she hadn't acknowledged in years, pressing gently behind her eyes. The door creaked. A young private, barely 19, stepped into the room carrying a tray of hot coffee. His hands trembled. The cups clinked together as he placed the tray down. One cup tipped over. Coffee spilled. "Oh God, I'm sorry," he stammered, fumbling for a rag. "I didn't mean..." Sarah reached calmly across the table, lifted the folder before the liquid touched the paper, and handed him the rag. "It's okay," she said. Her voice wasn't just gentle, it was solid, grounded. The private stood frozen, blinking up at her as if he had been bracing for reprimand. But Sarah just returned to the file. As the private left the room, he turned once more to look at her. And this time, his gaze carried something new, gratitude. As news of her true identity spread, both formally and in whispers, higher officers began quietly erasing traces of their previous interactions with her. A few altered reports, a few deleted camera feeds, a few casual excuses uttered in closed-door meetings. But respect cannot be fabricated. It has to be earned, or in this case, witnessed. One officer, a stoic man with gray streaking his sideburns, stood outside Sarah's temporary quarters late that night. He didn't knock. He just stood there for a long time, holding a file folder filled with reports he had once red-inked with sarcastic remarks. Then he turned away. Because sometimes an apology comes not in words, but in the heaviness of a step taken too late. 2 days after the range incident, as Sarah was finalizing her command structure notes, the door opened again. She didn't look up at first. Her focus was deep, her attention surgical. But then she felt it. A presence. Not loud, not commanding, but familiar in the most grounding way imaginable. She raised her eyes and he was there. Her husband. He stood in the doorway, taller than most, grayer than he had been during their last deployment together. His uniform bore no rank, no flag, only scars and silence. The kind of silence that matched hers perfectly. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Every eye in the hallway had turned to watch him enter. Every body instinctively stiffened, because everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew the stories, the ones that never made it to the press releases, the missions not recorded, the enemies erased without ever being logged. He walked up to her, slowly, carefully, like approaching something sacred. He didn't touch her, didn't reach out, just stood beside her chair, close enough that their shadows overlapped. She closed the folder, stood, looked up at him. Their eyes met, and in that gaze passed years of pain, pride, silence, and survival. Then slowly, without fanfare, he reached down and brushed his fingers along hers. Not to hold, just to say, I'm here. The hallway outside the briefing room remained quiet long after Sarah and her husband had entered. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't needed to. The door stood half open, a deliberate act of defiance against the closed doors and sealed minds that had tried to define her. Inside, the room was still. Sarah sat once again, hands folded on top of the folder, now marked with her clearance insignia. Her husband stood nearby, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, not in defiance, but in watchfulness, like a man who had seen too much to take safety for granted. Across the table, a row of officers stood awkwardly. The same ones who once waved her off with casual mockery now waited for her to speak, but she didn't speak. She simply flipped to the last page, signed the task force approval line, and closed the file. It was done. As Sarah and her husband walked out of the operations wing, a figure appeared in the hallway, a young recruit, barely out of high school, soft jaw, wide eyes, the kind of kid who still blinked too much when spoken to. He stood directly in her path, fidgeting. His hands were clasped in front of him, trembling slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracked. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." She stopped, turned toward him slowly. Her gaze was gentle but unflinching. "I didn't laugh," he said quickly, nervously. "But I didn't say anything either." For a moment, she said nothing. The boy seemed to brace himself for silence. Maybe rejection, maybe worse. But then Sarah nodded once, the smallest gesture in the world, and said, "You didn't say it." The words were so quiet they barely made it to his ears, but when they did, his breath caught in his throat. She was already walking away when his eyes welled with tears. Not of shame, but release, because she had given him something far more valuable than forgiveness. She had given him dignity. Back at the base, the mood had shifted. Entire departments had adjusted their tone. Briefings now included her task force by name. Recruit classes were taught never to assume based on appearance alone. Sarah's name wasn't spoken loudly, but it didn't need to be. It lived in tone, in pause, in caution. Kyle's locker had been emptied. The only thing left behind was a sticky note on the inside door. 4 words in his own handwriting. "I was wrong. Remember." The female recruit's name no longer existed on the system. The lieutenant who had mocked the box had been reassigned to a frigid outpost somewhere so remote it didn't show up on most internal maps. But Sarah had not asked for any of it. She had walked into their world, been torn down by their arrogance, and still left it better than she found it, and that's what stayed with them. Sarah left the base the same way she entered it. No motorcade, no ceremony, no salute. Just her backpack, now zipped, resting on one shoulder. The weight of the Delta Zero medal inside it, not as a trophy, but a truth. As she stepped past the gates, a soft wind blew dust along the path ahead of her. The same gravel that had once crunched under jeering boots now felt like a road of quiet honor. Her husband walked beside her, his steps perfectly matched to hers. They didn't speak, but the silence between them said everything. She paused briefly near the checkpoint, the very spot where it had all begun. The guard on duty, younger and newer than the others, straightened as she approached. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped himself. Instead, he stood at attention. Sarah offered no words, just a glance, one that passed like a torch, not a command. She turned and continued walking, the sun dipping low behind the horizon, painting the world in long shadows and golden light. Some weeks later, a new batch of recruits gathered in the central lecture hall. On the far wall behind glass hung a framed photo of a target. 3 holes, center mass, no plaque, no caption. Just a single card below it that read, "Respect is not given to the loudest voice. It is earned in silence." A new instructor stood before the recruits, pointing to the glass. "Before you laugh," he said, "remember her." No one asked who her was. They already knew. Sarah was never looking for vindication. She wasn't seeking redemption or recognition. She came because a mission called her. She left because she had nothing left to prove. But for those who witnessed her, those who tried to strip her dignity only to be blinded by its radiance, she became something else. A reminder, a reckoning, a myth made flesh. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or ignored, but chose to keep walking anyway, then this story is yours too. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Let Sarah's silence echo into the lives of those who need to remember. You don't have to speak loudly to change the world. You just have to stand steady,